they say they're going to do something, but it hasn't happened yet. And then that in-between place, that's when the community panic shoots up and people are emailing me, what does it mean? And the answer is like, Trump sneezed and thought it would be a good idea to repeal this. Like, I don't know, you know?
Hello, team, and welcome to Beerocracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross. I'm very excited today because I have Jaclyn Kelley-Widmer with me, who is a clinical professor of law at Cornell University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So we are going to be talking today about the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, who is a permanent resident with a green card, who was an activist on Columbia's campus for the Palestinian cause and has been detained by the Trump administration and is facing deportation. So there's a lot of layers to this conversation. Very happy to have you speak on it. And before we dive fully in, what are we drinking?
I figured I should represent Ithaca, New York today, where Cornell University is located. So I have an Ithaca Flower Power. It's like a classic IPA from the local brewery here.
Awesome. I love that. I have a Double Dog IPA. I really chose it for the image, which is a terrifying looking creature screaming fire. And I just felt like it kind of represented my thoughts on the Trump administration.
Yeah,
so
vibes.
let's start. All right. Cheers.
Cheers.
Oh, that's good. It tastes better than democracy at the moment. Okay. So question I always love to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think that's a good question to ask in all moments and this moment too. So I've been a professor at Cornell Law School for about 8 years now, and I've been practicing immigration law for 12 years. So I've been representing people in a lot of different scenarios. I've represented asylum seekers. I've represented people who are applying for status based on their abuse they've suffered in the U.S. I've worked with naturalization and DACA recipients and people in detention. And so I have a pretty wide range of experience. And I also teach students how to do these kinds of cases. So it's something that I'm thinking about at an intellectual and practical level.
Awesome. Very happy to have you. And you've done a lot of incredible work advocating for people. So let's talk a little bit about this arrest. Why don't you kind of update us on the case a bit and why it's causing such concern?
Right. So Mr. Khalil was arrested last weekend. I believe it was on March 8th. And he was arrested at his home by ICE officers who went to his residence, which is on Columbia's campus. And they said that they were detaining him because his student visa had been revoked. However, he is not on a student visa. He has a green card or lawful permanent residency. And his wife, who's 8 months pregnant, produced his green card to show them, which is exactly what I would have told a client who has a green card to do. Show your green card. And then they said, we're going to revoke that instead, and detained him anyway. So since then, he's been transferred to a detention facility in the small town of Jena, Louisiana, very far away from New York City and very remote in general. And today there was a hearing in a case that was filed in the Southern District of New York protesting his detention. And so I'm not sure what the outcome is yet of that hearing.
Yeah, I was actually outside as a protester.
Amazing.
Today. Yeah. So there was a lot of great manpower there of people advocating. And from what I've learned, he had been denied calls with his legal counsel and had one call that was on a government line that was being monitored, and it got cut very short. And from what I understand, the judge has ruled that he has 2 calls that he's allowed to have, an hour each, starting today and tomorrow, which is today's Wednesday and Thursday. But this case, which I think is people need to understand and recognize the difference, is what this case and this hearing was about whether or not he can be brought to New York. And then there's going to be another hearing and case with immigration and immigration court about whether or not he's going to be deported. And so I think that kind of difference is getting a little bit, not necessarily as clear as I think it needs to be, but so just people are aware about what was happening today. So my disclaimer, wherever you stand on the issue of Israel and Palestine is something that should not be of concern when we're dealing with a free speech issue, especially one like this.
I agree.
Which is someone that is lawfully protested against the government. And this is a huge, obscene action of authoritarianism and a power grab. What are your initial thoughts on this? And would you like to reiterate any more about why people should be scared?
Yes. So I really agree with you, Emily. I think it's really important for us to note that this is not really about the politics of what's going on in Israel and Palestine, but is really critically looking at the First Amendment protections that every person in the United States has. Doesn't matter what your citizenship is. Every person in the U.S. has constitutional rights, and one of those is to express themselves. And from what I see, Mr. Khalil has only engaged in lawful protest and lawful expression of his views. There has been no arrest or charges that are criminal charges about any of the activities that he's done. And so to me, this is a really clear example of retaliation for speech. And it's true that people have a lot of different opinions about this conflict, right? But I think this isn't even about that. The Trump administration is making it about that somewhat, but really it's around the First Amendment protections that should stand in his case, in all cases.
Absolutely. So they went in trying to revoke his student visa, and then and then his family was like, no, you're dumb. He's a permanent resident with a green card. Yeah. And then they're trying to take that back too. Could you explain the differences and the different protections that they grant people?
Yeah, absolutely. So a green card holder or lawful permanent resident is the most protected immigrant in the U.S., the most protected short of a U.S. citizen, right? So they've been granted lawful permanent residency. Permanent, right? So this isn't something that can just be revoked casually by the Secretary of State. It's really different than a student visa because student visas are governed by the Department of State, and there are different kinds of rules around student visas, and the revocation can be done in a different kind of process. But for those who have green cards, they can only be removed if they are subject to a ground of removability. This is what people might think of as deportability. But under the Immigration Nationality Act, they actually don't use the word deportation, it's removal. And so he can't be removed unless a ground of removability applies. There's a giant list of grounds of removability, but for the most part, they look at criminal convictions or interactions with the criminal justice system. For example, having an aggravated felony makes someone removable, even if they have lawful permanent residency. There's terrorism grounds, which I wondered if would come into play here, but I did finally get the charging document. And so we can see that actually he's been charged with a different ground, 237A4C, which is a ground of removability that says a person is deportable if the Secretary of State has a reasonable ground to believe that person would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the U.S.
I've seen that this is a very obscure rule that Marco Rubio is using. Could you elaborate more?
Right. So it's typical for someone to have their green card revoked, or what we would really say is they have to go before an immigration judge to have the government prove that this ground of removability or deportability applies to them, and they get to bring their attorney and they can argue why that ground doesn't apply to them. So we have the two sides, and then the judge will decide whether the ground of removability does apply. And if it does, then the person is deported and their green card would be revoked, essentially. But in this case, the ground of removability is one that's really not commonly used. I was actually speaking to a retired immigration judge earlier who was on the bench for 20 or 30 years who had never seen that provision used. I have never seen it, but I've only been an attorney for 12 years. And I have been doing some research to see if I could find any case law that showed use of this provision, and I haven't found any. But I think this could also be because the theory here is that this is a foreign policy question, and it's up to the executive to decide the foreign policy concerns. I think the government is trying to say the judge doesn't get to decide this. because it's really a matter of foreign policy that's not judicially reviewable. And if that holds, maybe that's why there's not case law on it.
Interesting. And so what the government is arguing is that he, because was protesting Israel policy on Columbia's campus, was an agent or a voice of, what is it, like, sympathizing with Hamas, which is a terrorist organization?
I assume that that's what the charge is going to look like, or what the argument would look like. The notice to appear, the charging document, just lists this provision that I mentioned in the Immigration Nationality Act and says that the Secretary of State has reasonable ground to believe that your presence or activities in the United States would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences. So it's a pretty broad statute the way it's written. Activities or presence, and then potentially serious consequences. So I think the administration's trying to say, well, you were inciting people to protest, or you were expressing views that sympathize with a foreign power or a foreign group that is violent and terroristic. So I think that's probably what the arguments will look like to support the charge, but I haven't seen them.
Interesting. And you mentioned previously that you just talked to a judge who's did immigration for 20 years and had not seen this statute being used.
Yep.
Have you, in recent memory, what cases have there been of deportation of foreign nationals due to speech issues?
I don't know what that has looked like in recent years, because this is a really complicated overlap between the First Amendment law and immigration law. I know that some people do practice at this intersection. I think it often looks like a First Amendment lawyer defending someone from removal proceedings based on their political activities, perhaps. But I haven't seen any cases on this personally, so I'm not sure I can comment what it might look like for others.
Totally. No, it's a fascinating intersection, and really speaks, I think, is kind of the prime example of the Trump administration at the moment of targeting immigrants and targeting criticism, right?
Right.
It's just such a wild thing to me. And it's like, no matter who you are, you should be concerned if dissent is cracked down on, regardless of who, and regardless of who's doing the dissent.
Yeah.
Is this unprecedented?
Well, the only case that I could find that seemed similar is a case from 1945 in the Supreme Court called Bridges v. Wixon. And this was about an Australian guy who was a communist. And so he was speaking at protests and distributing communist leaflets. And he, like Mr. Khalil, he filed a habeas petition to challenge his detention as well. And the court said that his statements revealed a militant advocacy of the cause of trade unionism, but did not teach or advocate or advise the subversive conduct that was condemned in the statute. And so they were really distinguishing between, you can have militant advocacy. Like the Supreme Court said, that's okay, but you have free speech rights. And the Supreme Court said those do apply to people who reside in the United States, even if they are not citizens. So that's the one case that I could find that was close to being on point. And it's from a long time ago.
Very long time ago.
Yeah.
And not great things were happening in 1945.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So this is part of a bigger issue, right? Of the targeting of immigrants and migrants from the Trump administration. And you had mentioned previously, actually, before we started recording, that you have been to the detention facility where Mr. Khalil is being held at the moment. What was it like?
Yes, I have been there. I take students to work in immigration detention every semester. So I've been to several immigration detention centers in Louisiana, including this one in Gina. One thing to say is that it's very remote. It takes a long time to get there. It's a solid 4 or 5 hours from New Orleans. And when we go, we stay in Alexandria, Louisiana, which is in the middle of the state. And then it's another hour to 2 hours to drive to Gina. So it's really remote. And I think that that means that the access is very limited by lawyers, by any family members who might want to see that person, right? It's nearly impossible to get there. And then the facility itself is very, it appears like a criminal jail, basically. There's a lot of barbed wire around it. When you're going in, you have to pass through like a chain link fence. Then the gate closes behind you, but you're still inside the chain link fence, and you go through the next gate, which is opened after the first gate is closed. They're going to confiscate your personal effects, or at least check them, because it's jail, right? It's basically jail. We say in the US that immigration detention is civil in nature and it's not supposed to be punitive, but that's not how I see it experienced by people who are in detention. And then in GINA, we see that there's often been complaints lodged against that facility. I worked with some attorneys who were lodging complaints against the lack of medical care that one of their clients was receiving, who suffered from seizures. So we do see some really difficult conditions in GINA.
Wow. What is it? Are ICE officials and people who work at these facilities, are they hostile?
Some are, right? I think some people are just trying to do their job. They're in rural Louisiana, like lots of rural places in the US. It's like, what are the jobs?
What are the options? Right?
Often they're detention centers, prisons, that kind of thing. The people that run that facility, it's run by a private company. And I think that the detained folks in there, when I am doing consults, if I mention to them that it is a private company that runs the facility, often they say something like, oh, that makes sense. And I think that's because they see that there's this underlying sort of like capitalistic bottom line that's going on here, where the motivation is to keep costs low and the number of people detained high, because it's a business.
Right. Which classic private prison detention, situation.
Exactly.
So we've seen, right, there's been a lot of, it was one of Trump's rallying cries, right? A lot of action against the deportation of migrants. When originally they're like, we're only going after people that have, crimes.
Yeah.
That went straight out the window.
It really did. Right?
It went out so fast. It feels like very powerless, right? And you don't know really how to help. And you're on, in some ways, the front lines of trying to advocate for these people's rights.
Yeah.
What is that like? What is your day to day? How are you fighting for these people? And how can a normal person who doesn't have these resources help?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think one thing that's been amazing is to see the energy. I'm working with a lot of law students and a lot of community members who are really dedicated to protecting the rights of the immigrants in the community, whether they're undocumented people or green card holders or student visas, anybody in between, right? Because everybody is feeling the risk and the fear, even people who have green cards. And a few weeks ago or a few months ago, a friend with a green card was feeling nervous. And I was like, listen, green card holders are fine. No, okay, I was wrong. And that person was right to feel nervous because of what we're seeing now. And so the energy of people who are trying to mobilize to protect people has been wonderful. I do a lot of Know Your Rights presentations in the area. And these aren't legal advice, but they are a way of people understanding what their constitutional rights actually are, like your right to remain silent, and what are some of the options you could have if ICE comes to your door or stops you in the street. I didn't really realize that we would need to do so many Know Your Rights presentations immediately, but we did see, of course, that immigration enforcement ramped up right away, including here in upstate New York, where we had somebody arrested by ICE in downtown Ithaca in late January. So we're seeing it everywhere. And so another thing that's been really hard is that the administration publishes new rules or new policies really frequently. Like every day or every few days, there's another potential thing. Sometimes it's here's a new executive order, here's a new program that we're going to roll out. Sometimes it's we're going to rescind a program that's existed under Biden, like humanitarian parole. But then not all of these actually come about right away, or they say they're going to do something, but it hasn't happened yet. And then that in-between place, that's when the community panic shoots up and people are emailing me, what does it mean? And the answer is like, Trump sneezed and thought it would be a good idea to repeal this. Like, I don't know, we're going to have to wait and see what further guidance comes out, but that's not very satisfying. So in the question of like, what's the day-to-day like? It's stressful.
Yeah, no, I can only imagine. Thank you for the work you're doing and for literally just being, I feel like you're just like punched in the face repeatedly from all different directions. And you're just trying to like stay standing and you're like, I don't know what's happening.
That really describes it well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that feels accurate. I'm really sorry. But thank you for all that you do.
Yeah.
I know you work a lot with DACA recipients.
Yes.
What's the vibe there?
It's interesting with DACA. We haven't really seen much going on in this administration with respect to DACA. And I think a big part of that has to do with the litigation that's been ongoing. We were really anticipating that DACA was going to end because of the challenge to its legality that's been working its way through the courts for some time. And recently it was with the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, but the Fifth Circuit dropped their decision on January 17th at 5 p.m., aka the last possible working hour before the inauguration. And
I love when they do that.
Yeah, really timed it in a way. And so that decision said that DACA is at least somewhat unlawful because it provides work authorization and deferral of removal. But it also said, well, maybe it's fine to separate those two things. Maybe the deferral of removal is okay. We do that all the time for people like TPS holders and other folks who get prosecutorial discretion and are not removed. But we're just not so sure if the work authorization is okay. We're going to send it back to the district court, the lower court. So now it's sitting in the lower court. I think there was some ruling that happened today, but I actually haven't had a chance to look at it. But what basically we're seeing the Trump administration kind of wait for the courts to work out what's going on with DACA. And because it didn't go towards the Supreme Court, but got remanded to a lower court, it does buy DACA recipients some more time.
We'll take it.
Yeah,
we'll take what we can get.
Exactly. It gives us a little bit more time, and hopefully what DACA recipients should be doing is trying to figure out what other options they have. A project that I'm running has found that about 80% of DACA recipients have other better long-term options, whether that's work visas, humanitarian visas, family, or what have you. So it's a good time for people to try and figure out some other path.
Okay. That is great for anyone who's a DACA recipient.
Yeah. Or
I'm sorry you're having to go through this, but take the time and try to, look at options.
Yeah.
So now that Khalil, has been detained and I guess charges have been brought because originally it didn't really seem like it. And he was kind of just shuffled around without really any communication because we love a super lawful administration. What happens next?
Right. So we will see a decision from the Southern District of New York about whether or not they have jurisdiction over his detention and can he be moved back to New York or released from detention. Lots and lots of people are not held in detention while their immigration case is proceeding. Only some people are under mandatory detention, and those are people with really serious criminal convictions, which he does not have. So he doesn't mandatorily have to be detained under the law. They just decided to do that. ICE does not have to do that. So maybe we'll see him get released while his immigration court proceedings are pending. But some people do fight their case, lots of people, from inside detention as well. So I'm hopeful that he'll be released, which would be good for his case. He'd be able to go to an immigration court outside detention. And then I could talk to you about what court might look like.
What would court look like?
Yeah. So
just he would throwing it out there.
Yeah, let's go there. So he would go before an immigration judge. He'll have his attorney, and then there'll be an opposing counsel, which is an ICE attorney, arguing for his deportation and arguing that he is removable under that provision of the act we were talking about for adverse foreign policy consequences. And this is the thing that we haven't seen in immigration court before. And so I think what the administrations might try to do is say, well, there is no judicial review. This is a determination that we've made. But on his charging document, it does set him a court date, March 27th, 2025. That's in a detained court. So if he gets out, that date will change. But for now, they did set him a court date, which means he gets to go before the judge and argue that he's not removable. And then the judge would do a legal analysis and figure out whether they think that charge applies or not. Then if he loses, he could appeal.
If he's appealing, though, would he have to go back to, from what I understand, he's from Syria. He's Palestinian descent from Syria.
That's right.
Would he have to go back to Syria during the appeal process?
No, you can appeal from within the United States. And in fact, people who are in detention stay in the U.S. while their appeal is pending, typically. So he could go to the Board of Immigration Appeals. That's the next level up. If he loses there, he would go to the circuit court. I think by moving him to Louisiana, they might be trying to get his case venued in the Fifth Circuit, which is the most conservative circuit, right? Whereas if he gets moved back to New York, he'd be in the Second Circuit, which could be friendlier.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Conservatives love the Fifth Circuit. For most people who are not aware, most of the big Supreme Court cases that overturn a lot of pre-existing decisions that are generally considered to be, I don't know, it's not liberal in nature, but liberal in nature. Yeah. A lot of those court cases start in the Fifth Circuit.
And that DACA rescission case is being litigated in the Fifth Circuit. And so, because they're like, well, this is where the judges will be friendlier to this argument.
Right.
Yeah.
We love that. I mean, it just further plays onto the whole thing that the Trump administration is the administration of lawsuits. This is what they're trying to do. They're trying to get it up to the Supreme Court, which is in favor of Trump, right? And make those decisions
and see what happens. And then we're going to really see, like, what does the court do with something like this? Because the court should be really, really concerned about the First Amendment implications here, let alone the immigration piece. I would love to refer you to some of my First Amendment or constitutional law colleagues to like really talk about what those protections should look like and do that analysis. But we know that is super concerning, let alone the whole, we can just revoke your green card and detain you, even though we didn't know you had a green card, piece of the immigration processes that are not going according to what the law really says.
Cool. Cool. But yeah, no, this is a huge free speech concern and everyone should be concerned about it because it sounds like immigrants are the easiest ones to get rid of, but that doesn't mean it's never going to stop. Right?
That's right. I mean, we've certainly seen immigrants be the scapegoat and target of this administration and the Trump 1 administration, the entire campaign. That's definitely been a scapegoat, a target. But I think we should all be worried because these are protections that apply to everyone. And if we see this kind of dissident or controversial opinion cracked down on, like what's the next one? I think we really should be worried.
Right. Well, Jaclyn, anything else you would like to touch on that we didn't get to talk about?
That's all for me. I think this has been a really interesting conversation. There's just so much going on in the world of immigration, but this case, I think, has really highlighted a number of the different tensions, like from detention to green card revocation and kind of a lot of these different issues together with First Amendment. So, I guess the silver lining is it is getting a lot of attention. There have been a lot of protests, and hopefully that means we'll see some change in outcome or a positive outcome.
I hope so. It's comforting to see a lot of pushback. I was talking with a friend. Yeah. It feels like the pushback to the Trump admin was a little bit slower going the second administration, the second time around.
Yeah.
But now it feels like it's gaining momentum and things are starting to gain steam. So fingers crossed.
I think people were a little bit like caught in the whirlwind of the first few weeks, which was the idea. And they did say they were going to do that. So now we're like, wait a minute, let me take a breath and this is not okay. And we need to figure out what our collective response should be for democracy, politics, whatever they may be.
Totally. This, once again, this should concern everyone. This is a crackdown on free speech, regardless of immigration status and regardless of topic. This is a crackdown on free speech. So, Jaclyn, thank you so much for being here. And I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Beerocracy.